The battlefield stretched wide under the burning sun. Smoke rose in thick lines, and the ground shook with the clash of steel and the thunder of marching boots. Men shouted, cried, and struggled to hold their lines. For hours, the sound of war had filled the air, and the dust made it hard to breathe. Daniel Cross stood among his soldiers, his face covered in dirt and sweat. His sword felt heavy in his hand, and his body ached from the endless fighting. He was their commander, but even he could feel the hopelessness settling over them. Every charge seemed weaker than the last, and every step felt like one closer to defeat. His men looked to him for strength, but he could see the fear in their eyes. They were fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them. Across the plain, the opposing force moved like a storm. Their banners waved high, and their lines seemed endless. Daniel's men had fought bravely, but their numbers were few, and the long struggle had drained them. Daniel raised his hand, signaling his men to hold their ground. Arrows cut through the sky, and the clash of metal echoed again. The cries of the wounded filled the air. He told himself that they could not give in, yet deep in his heart, he feared they would not last much longer. Then, just as another wave of enemy soldiers advanced, a sound broke through the chaos. It was a horn, deep and clear, cutting across the noise of battle. Every head turned. Even the enemy slowed, confused by the strange sound. The horn echoed again, commanding attention.
Out.
Daniel lifted his eyes to the far edge of the field. His breath caught in his throat. At first he thought it was a trick of the dust and the light, but as the shape grew closer, he knew it was real. A rider approached, the horse tall and powerful, its hooves shaking the ground with every stride. The figure upon it wore shining armor, silver and gold, gleaming even through the smoke. The sight was unlike anything Daniel's men had seen that day. The rider carried no banner, but the very presence demanded attention. As the figure drew closer, Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew her. He knew the way she held herself, the way her armor fit with strength and grace. His voice almost failed him, but inside he whispered her name. Ilara. It had been years since he had last seen her. Years since she walked away from him, and from the life they once shared. She had been more than a wife. She had been a queen. Together, once, they had ruled with strength and trust. But the bond broke, and so did the life they built. Never thought he would see her again, not like this. She rode through the battlefield without fear, her long braided hair catching the light of the sun. Her crown rested above her brow, sharp and proud. Her armor was crafted with care, shining with intricate detail that spoke of power and command. The soldiers froze. On Daniel's side, men lowered their weapons in disbelief. On the enemy's side, men hesitated, staring with wide eyes. No one moved. No one dared strike while she passed. Ilara brought her horse to a stop in the middle of the plain. Dust swirled around her as silence spread across the field. Her gaze swept over the armies, and even the strongest men looked down, unable to meet her eyes. Daniel's heart pounded. He remembered her strength, her voice, the way she could make men believe in something greater than themselves. She had been gone so long, yet here she was, alive and unbroken, stepping into the heart of war as though she commanded the earth itself. He wondered why she had returned now. Had she come to save them? Or to judge them? Had she come for him? The men around Daniel whispered her name. Some said it like a prayer, others like a curse. But all of them lowered their weapons. For the first time since the war began, the battlefield was quiet. Daniel stood frozen, his sword limp at his side. He could not take his eyes off her. His ex-wife, the queen who once shared his life, had returned in full armor, and her arrival had stopped a war. The plain was silent. Dust hung in the air, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and sweat. Thousands of men stood frozen, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed on the woman in shining armor. The war that had consumed the land paused, as if the world itself had chosen to wait for her next move. Ilara dismounted from her horse with calm grace. The heavy plates of her armor did not weigh her down. Her boots sank slightly into the earth as she walked forward, every step steady and certain. Her long braid fell over her shoulder, golden strands catching the fading light of day. The crown she wore glimmered, and her armor reflected the sun like fire on water. The soldiers whispered her name. Some spoke with reverence, others with fear. Too many, she was a memory, a queen who had vanished when her people needed her most. To others, she was a ghost of the past, returned to pass judgment. Daniel could not move. His heart hammered inside his chest as she came closer. He remembered the years when he stood beside her, when they fought together, when they believed in the same dream. He remembered the day it all broke apart, when harsh words and heavy silence ended what they once shared. She had left, and he had told himself she would never return. Now she stood before him, her gaze fixed and unshaken. Her eyes were sharp, but not cruel. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the cost of power and carried the weight of it alone. "Lower your weapons," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the plain. The words were not shouted, yet every man heard them. Her command cut through the air like steel. Daniel's soldiers obeyed without question, dropping their blades to their sides. Even the enemy, uncertain and unsettled, let their spears fall toward the ground. No one dared to test her. Daniel forced himself to step forward. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, as though he were walking into a storm. When he reached her, he stopped, his eyes never leaving hers. "You should not be here," he said quietly, though his voice trembled. "And yet I am," Elara answered. Her tone was not harsh, but it carried weight. It was the same voice he remembered from long ago, the voice that could turn fear into courage, the voice that once made him believe nothing was impossible. The men around them stood in silence. No one dared interrupt. The clash of battle had faded, and in its place came an uneasy calm. Daniel studied her face. She was older now, her features sharper, her presence stronger. Time had not weakened her. If anything, it had made her greater. He thought of the years lost, the battles fought without her, the choices that had driven them apart. "Why now?" he asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she carried an answer she was not yet ready to share. "Because it must be now," she said. Daniel felt the weight of her words, though he did not fully understand them. He looked at the men around him, their faces filled with awe and confusion. To them, she was more than a woman. She was a symbol, a living reminder of a time when the kingdom stood strong under her rule. Elara lifted her sword, not to strike, but to show. The blade shone bright, catching the last light of the sun. "This war ends tonight," she declared. Her voice spread across the plain, carried by the wind. The soldiers stirred, their hearts caught between fear and hope. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He saw the way the men looked at her, the way they lowered their heads in respect. Even the enemy bent slightly, unable to stand against the force of her presence. For a moment, Daniel forgot the years of bitterness. He forgot the arguments, the silence, the pain of their separation. For a moment, he saw her not as the woman who left him, but as the queen who had once led them all. Alara's gaze met his once more. There was no softness in her eyes, but there was something else, something unspoken, something that stirred old memories deep within him. At a battlefield waited. Daniel knew the war had changed, not by the clash of swords or the fall of men, but by the return of one woman. His ex-wife stood before him in full armor, and with only her presence, she had stopped the fighting. The battlefield stayed quiet, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the kind of silence that held weight, heavy with memory and fear. The men stood still, their swords lowered, their shields at their sides, their eyes fixed on the woman who had brought the fight to a sudden halt. Daniel did not move. His soldiers waited for his orders, but even he could not speak. His heart was trapped between the present and the past. The sight of Elara had broken through the years of distance, pulling him back to moments he thought he had buried. He remembered the first time he saw her. She was not wearing armor then. She was in the great hall, her voice carrying across the chamber as she addressed the council. She had been younger, yet already strong in presence, already a leader in the eyes of men twice her age. Daniel, then a soldier, just earning his place, had stood among the guards and listened. He had not known then that she would change his life. In the years that followed, they had walked side by side. He became her captain, and later her husband. Together, they faced rebellions, storms, and long winters. Together, they dreamed of a kingdom stronger than fear, stronger than division. She believed in him, and he believed in her. Those memories burned in Daniel's mind now, as he stood only a few steps away from her. The years between them had been long, filled with silence and regret. The night she left remained carved into his soul. There had been no shouting, no anger, only a cold quiet that hurt more than any blade. He had watched her walk away, and she had not turned back. Now on the field where men expected only death, she had returned. And with her return came all the weight of what they once were. Ilara did not look away from him. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, seemed to search his face for something, though he could not tell if it was blame, sorrow, or the faintest trace of the bond they once shared. Around them, the men sensed the connection, even without words. They saw the way Daniel's breath caught, the way Ilara's steps slowed. When she neared him, the soldiers whispered again. Some said she had come back to save them. Others feared she had come to claim judgment. But all of them knew there was something between the commander and the queen that went deeper than war. Daniel remembered the sound of her laughter, soft in the halls when the world outside was harsh. He remembered the nights they had stood on the castle balcony, looking out at the stars, speaking of a future that seemed certain then. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the steady promise in her touch. Those promises had broken. It failed her, or perhaps she had failed him. No longer mattered which. What mattered was that she was here now, standing tall in armor, holding the battlefield in the palm of her hand. He saw the way his men looked at her. To them, she was more than a queen. She was hope, and hope was rarer than gold in times like these. Even the enemy soldiers shifted uneasily, their fear mixing with awe. No man wanted to be the first to raise a sword against her. Ilara spoke again, her voice calm but strong. "This land does not need more blood," she said. "It needs strength, needs unity, and it will have it." Her words settled into the hearts of the men. Daniel felt them strike him deeper than any blade could. He had heard her speak like this before, in council rooms and war camps, in moments when despair threatened to consume them all. Her voice had always cut through the darkness. He realized then what he had almost forgotten. She was not simply a figure from his past. She was the leader who had carried them through countless trials. She was the queen who had once made him believe that a better world was possible. The years apart had not dimmed her. It only sharpened her into something greater. Daniel lowered his sword fully now, the metal tip sinking into the dirt. His men followed, one by one. Even the enemy soldiers, as if bound by the same force, lowered theirs too. For a long moment, there were no orders, no cries, no clash of blades. Only the weight of her presence and the echo of the past binding them all together. Daniel looked into Ilara's eyes and knew this was not an accident. She had returned for a reason, though. He did not yet know if that reason would heal what was broken or open wounds even deeper. What he did know was this: the war had shifted, and so had his heart. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky with shades of red and gold. The field was still, filled with men who had forgotten their rage and fear. All eyes were on the woman standing tall in armor, her sword lifted in the fading light. Lara's voice had already stopped the fighting, but now the moment demanded more. She had to show them that her presence was not only a memory of the past, but a power that lived in the present. Daniel stood near her, his sword in the dirt, his chest heavy with old emotions. He watched her with the same wonder that filled the eyes of every soldier around them. He knew she had always been strong, but now she seemed more than that. She seemed unshakable, a force that no army could match. Lara's gaze swept across the field. She saw both her people and those who had stood against them. To her, they were not simply two armies. They were broken pieces of a kingdom that once had been whole. She had returned to see it shattered, and she would not let it stay that way. She took a step forward, her armor catching the light. Her voice rang out, steady and clear. "This war ends now. Not with another clash, not with more blood in the soil. Ends because I say it ends." The soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. No one moved to defy her. Daniel's men lowered their heads in respect, and some even dropped to one knee. The enemy stood stiff, unsure, but none lifted their weapons again. The power in her words had bound them all in silence. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low, but filled with awe. "They will follow you," he said. Ilara turned her eyes to him. For a brief moment, there was a shadow of the woman he once knew, the woman who had stood beside him in battles long past. Then her gaze hardened again, full of resolve. They will follow because they must. This land cannot endure another year of this. She raised her sword higher, letting the sunlight flash from its blade. Lay down your arms, all of you. From this moment forward, there is no enemy here. There is only one people, one land, one future. The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel looked to his soldiers. One by one, they dropped their weapons fully to the ground. The clatter of steel echoed across the plain. Then something unexpected happened. On the other side of the field, a captain among the enemy stepped forward. He looked at Alara, then at his men, and with a slow motion, he lowered his spear and placed it into the dirt. His men followed. Soon the sound of metal hitting the ground filled the air from both sides. For the first time in years, two armies faced each other without hate in their eyes. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had commanded men for so long, seen them fight and fall, but he had never seen such a moment. It was not fear that held them still, it was something stronger. Respect. Ilara lowered her sword at last, her point touching the soil. This kingdom belongs to no warlord, no rival, no broken crown, she said. It belongs to its people. I'll see it whole again. The men bowed their heads, moved by her words. Even those who had once sworn against her could not resist the weight of her presence. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quieter now, only for her. You have taken control without striking a single blow. Her eyes stayed on the soldiers before her. That is the only victory that matters. He felt the truth in her words. He thought of all the lives spared in that single choice, all the blood that would not stain the earth tonight. And yet deep inside, he wondered what it would mean for them. For her return. For the bond they once shared and the distance that had grown between them. The plain was filled with men who only hours ago would have killed one another. Now they stood still, their weapons in the dirt, their eyes lifted to the queen who had returned to claim them all. Daniel looked at her, and he knew this was only the beginning. The battlefield no longer looked like a place of war. The weapons lay scattered on the ground, and the men stood waiting, unsure of what the next moment would bring. The air was heavy with dust and silence, broken only by the sound of the wind moving across the plain. Ilara stood at the center, her sword lowered, her crown shining in the last glow of the sun. She looked at the soldiers who had once been enemies and saw not two sides, but one people who had been torn apart by years of blood. Her heart carried the weight of all that had been lost, but she would not let that weight crush the chance that stood before them now. Daniel came closer, his eyes fixed on her. He felt pride and sorrow together, emotions tangled so tightly that he could not tell them apart. He had fought for years without her, carrying his men through battles he thought would never end. Now, with only her presence, she had ended the war in a single breath. You have their loyalty again, he said quietly. Lara turned her gaze to him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no boast, only certainty. I have their duty, but loyalty must be earned. That will take time. Daniel nodded. He knew she was right. Men could lower their weapons in fear or awe, but to follow with their hearts was different. That was what she had always understood better than anyone. The soldiers began to gather around her. They looked at her as if waiting for her to speak again, waiting for her to tell them what their lives meant now that the fighting had ended. Some still held doubt in their faces, but many looked at her as though they had seen a light after years in the dark. Ilara lifted her head and spoke. Her words carried steady across the plain. No more divided banners. No more brother against brother. From this day forward, there is no enemy among us. We are one land, one people, and I will see it rise again. A murmur spread through the ranks. The men nodded, some even raising their voices to agree. It was not a cry of victory, but a sound of release, like a burden had been lifted. Daniel watched them, his chest tight. He had seen men cheer after battles before, but never like this. This was not the cheer of blood won. This was the sound of men who had been given back their hope. He looked at Ilara again. She had been his wife once, his partner, his closest ally. That bond had broken, but the truth was that part of him had never stopped believing in her. Even in the darkest years, when he told himself she was gone, there had always been a piece of him that remembered what she could be while she stood before him. Not as the woman he once loved, but as the queen who had returned to save them all. You have changed everything, he said. Her eyes softened for a moment, just enough to remind him of the woman he once knew. No, Daniel. They will change everything. I only gave them the chance. Her words struck him deeper than any memory. She had never fought for herself alone. She had always fought for the people, for the kingdom. That was why they listened to her now, why even their enemies bowed their heads. The sky darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon. The battlefield, once filled with screams, now stood quiet under the weight of her return. Daniel stepped back, giving her the space she needed. She turned to the men and began to speak again, not as a figure from the past, but as the leader of their future. Her voice rose strong and clear, laying the path ahead, and the men listened. Daniel stood there, his sword forgotten in the dirt. He knew the world was different now. The war was over, and though scars would remain, a new beginning had been set in motion. Alara had returned, not as his wife, not as a memory, but as the queen who would bind the broken pieces of the land together. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt something he thought had been lost forever. He felt hope.